So I think some people are still filtering in, and I've just put again in the chat there that feel free to share where in the world you're joining us from, because I know this is a really international group. So welcome to you wherever you are in the world, and whatever your role and whatever your interest is. Really happy to be here with you all. So I'm Lisa Gill. I'm an organisational self-management coach. And with me is Helen Sanderson. Do you want to say hello, Helen?
Hi, everybody. I'm Helen, as Lisa says. I used to be a consultant. I still do some consulting, and then moved into directly serving people. And I'm excited to share with you some of what we've tried and learned.
Yeah, so as Helen said, the purpose of today's session is to explore this topic of self-managing organizations and what that means for leadership. So we're going to have some interactive elements. We will be putting you into breakout rooms at times where you'll be chatting to each other. So it's great if you can have your video on. If it's not possible, then we understand, but it just helps to see who you're talking to. And we're also going to have, obviously, share with you our experience, some knowledge and what we've learned working with self-managing organizations, and Helen in particular, some very practical examples from her experiences in Wellbeing Teams. So we are going to have, as I said, a mix of some interactive elements, some input, and at the end we're also going to have some time for questions, really to collect questions. So I can't promise that we'll be able to answer many of them, perhaps one or two. We've got a lot that we want to share with you. So if you have throughout the session, if you have questions, our invitation is to make a note of them, kind of have them in your pocket, because we're going to have an opportunity for you to record them, to share them at the end. And then we'll try to answer one or two if we can. And then our promise is that we're going to collate all of your questions and write a follow-up blog, a kind of frequently asked questions, kind of follow-up, answering the questions that you have and the ones that are most popular, if you like. So we will be responding to your questions after the fact. So kind of keep them in mind, keep them to one side, and otherwise, yeah, hope you enjoy the session. We're also going to share a kind of takeaway, like a one-pager afterwards, so that if you are interested to learn more about some of the resources we share, you'll have some links and some resources to go and learn a bit more. So let's get started. So we wanted to give you an opportunity to meet some of the group and to sort of say hello and to come out of this big Zoom void and into some breakout rooms so that you can meet a fellow human being and talk together before we get started. So I'm going to create some breakout rooms. And the questions that we're going to ask you to discuss once you arrive in your breakout room are two questions. So what big question do you bring to this session? And what sparked your curiosity about this event? So I'm going to create some breakout rooms here. And I'm just going to shuffle so that Helen and Alessandra and I stay in this main room here. So I'm doing a bit of manual reshuffling. Where are you, Alessandra? Oh, okay, great. So what will happen if you're not familiar with breakout rooms in Zoom is that you will be whisked into a new virtual space, and you'll find yourself with one or two other people. And I'm going to give you about 5 or 6 minutes, and then we'll bring you back to the main room, and then we'll reshuffle and put you into a different breakout room. So you'll get to meet 2 people and share your answers to these questions. So it's not a lot of time. It will feel quite fast. So when you land in your breakout room, you can sort of say, hi, I'm Lisa, introduce each other, and then answer these questions. Oh, the big question I'm coming with is this. So that's about as much time as you'll have. So I'm just going to reshuffle a little bit because there are some people who've just joined us. So let me make sure you have a breakout room. And if you get really stuck in the breakout rooms, there is a button in the breakout rooms where you can raise your hand. So if you arrive there, and give it a minute or two, because it sometimes takes a while. But if you've been lonely for a minute or two, then you can raise your hand and we can come and help you. Or you can always click in the bottom right-hand corner. There's an option to leave the room and come back to the main room. So if you get really stuck, you can always do that and hang out with us in the main room. Okay, so I'm going to open the rooms now and we'll see you back here in about 5 minutes. So enjoy. So Alessandra, I want to pause recording. Okay. So welcome back, everyone. So we wanted to, before we kind of get into the content that we're going to share with you, we wanted to get a bit of a sense, a quick pulse check of what you as a group think and feel about self-managing organizations. What does that mean to you? What are some ideas that you have about what that means? So we've created a sort of poll in Menti. So if you go into your chat window, so if you, along the bottom, you have this chat button, and if you click that, the chat window appears on the right of your Zoom window. And you'll see that I've pasted a link into the chat there, a menti.com link. And if you click that, it will take you to that particular poll. And then you can drag and drop the agree, disagree bars for the different questions, that the statements that we've put there. So I'll share my screen to show you what it looks like. And it will be populating it real time as you fill it out. So here we go. So far, here we go. So yeah, these are some statements that Helen and I often find people, ideas that people have about what a self-managing organization is. So there's no structure and therefore it's chaos. That decision-making takes a long time. That people do what they want and there's no accountability. And that there's no leadership, so everyone has to be equal. So interesting to see that not many people agree with these statements, but the last one seems to be something that people agree with more than the others. So just give you 30 seconds more maybe to see what our poll looks like in the group. Okay, it seems to have stabilized out. So yeah, that's interesting. So we can keep, that will stay open, so you can keep voting if you haven't managed to do that yet. So that will stay open and we can have a look at it perhaps afterwards. And we'll share it also in our blog, that we're going to do a follow-up blog. You know, this was the picture of the group and what people's understanding of self-management was. So we're going to share now, I'm going to say something about self-management. What is it and why is it interesting and relevant now? Why are people starting to talk about it more? Perhaps you've read about it in Harvard Business Review, or you've been hearing about it on the grapevine. It's something that you're looking into. It's kind of becoming more trendy, like agile. So let me share my screen here. So I'm going to, how this is going to go now is sort of, I'm going to share some context and like a very tiny bit of theory. And then Helen is going to share practical examples from her experience in Wellbeing Teams. So we're going to attempt to sort of dispel some myths and misconceptions about self-managing organizations, and also share some examples of what it looks like in practice. So self-managing organizations are, this is a definition, they're organizations that radically decentralize authority in a formal and systematic way across the whole organization. So you might have heard of self-managing teams, or you might be feeling like, since lockdown, we've been working from home, and so we've naturally been a little bit more self-managing. Is that what self-management is? So self-managing organizations, it's organizations that are very intentional about, in a formal and systematic way, distributing authority and decision-making and various processes across the whole organization. So it's not just a pocket, but the whole organization. And in terms of why this is starting to become an attractive idea, is and perhaps you've seen some of these statistics many times before, but 15% of employees worldwide are engaged, which is a really small number when you think about how many, therefore, are either disengaged or actively disengaged, not emotionally invested in their work at all. And this was quite shocking. Only 12% of employees in Europe say that they're always consulted before objectives are set for their work. So it's quite rare, actually, for many people in organizations to be involved in their own objectives. And then this statistic on the right, the cost of bureaucracy. So when bureaucracy becomes overwhelming in organizations, this is a figure that Gary Hamel, a business professor, came up with. It costs the US economy $3 trillion in lost economic output. So there is something about the top-down traditional way of working that's working less and less well. And so this is just a snapshot of many different organizations all around the world that are exploring in different ways self-managing ways of working and organizing. And these are from all over the world. So there's Yash is in India, you have Zappos in the US, Nearsoft is Mexico, Ukraine, China. So there's all companies across all different industries all over the world that are exploring this. So it's no longer a kind of radical fringe idea. And in the bottom right-hand corner here, you'll see I've singled out some health and social care organizations that are self-managing, one of which is Wellbeing Teams. And Helen's going to share some examples throughout this session of how Wellbeing Teams, what self-management looks like there. And also there's this organization, Wurzorg, which is an organization that is very inspiring to Helen and I. Perhaps some of you have heard of Wurzorg. For those who don't know, it's a nursing organization in the Netherlands. So they have 15,000 nurses, and they work in self-managed teams of 12. And they have no managers. They have a very, very small centralized staff function. I think it's 10 people or fewer than that. And they're totally self-managed and incredibly effective and successful. So across all of the kind of metrics of patient satisfaction, employee satisfaction, reducing costs and overheads, it's a very successful case study that's being sort of spread all over the world now. So these are just some examples of self-managing organizations. If I go back there, jumped ahead a bit. There we go. So myth number one. So this first statement that you voted on. So there's no structure and therefore it's chaos. So people often have this sense that if it's self-managing and you take away managers, then it's a free-for-all. Whereas in reality, self-managing organizations, the successful ones, reinvent these 5 key processes in a very clearly defined way. So from decision-making through hierarchy to clear distributed decision-making processes. So decision-making authority is pushed down to all of the edges of the organization, and it's very clear how decisions are made and who can make what decisions. And from static job descriptions to more detailed dynamic roles. And they're often granular. So Helen will share something later on about how roles are designed and held at wellbeing teams, but often a person can hold more than one role, and it's very clear what good in that role looks like and what the expectations are to your other colleagues. And of course, from information shared on a need-to-know basis or held by managers to information shared transparently across the whole organization, so that we all have access to the information we need in order to do our jobs well. And from performance management and annual reviews to clarity of what good looks like, and feedback processes which are owned by individuals and teams. So we hold each other to account and we give each other feedback. And then finally, conflict resolution managed through HR to peer-owned conflict transformation processes. So all self-managing organizations are unique and different. There's no one size fits all. But all of them have reinvented these 5 processes on the left in some version or another. So contrary to the idea that there's no structure, there are structures. They're just different structures, and they tend to be more dynamic and they tend to be more distributed. So over to you, Helen, who's going to share something about wellbeing teams and what this myth, how it looks like in wellbeing teams.
Thank you. About 10 years ago, 20 years ago, I worked as an occupational therapist, and then I started working as a consultant, including working as the government's expert advisor on person-centered approaches. And I got introduced to self-management by reading a book by Frederick Laloux. And that led me to work with our team, our consultancy team, to move to self-management. So I gave up being the CEO, and together we organised ourselves differently through self-management. And then 3 years ago, I set up Wellbeing Teams. And that's because I was so inspired by what Frederick Laloux had done. I wanted to see if we could do something similar in the UK. And the purpose of Wellbeing Teams are to do whatever we can to support people to live well at home and be part of their community. So in the UK, that kind of service would be called home care. And we support people, and obviously that includes older people experiencing cancer. We describe ourselves as a value-led organisation, and our values are compassion, responsibility, and it's the responsibility bit that particularly relates to self-management, collaboration, curiosity, creativity, and flourishing. Because the Wellbeing and Wellbeing Team stands for everybody's wellbeing, the people we support, and team members as well. So in the UK, our regulators in health and care is called the Care Quality Commission. And we were the first organisation in adult social care to be registered with them, and then the first self-managing organisation to be inspected by them. And we got the highest inspection rating, which was outstanding. And we also got that for well-led. So it was amazing to us, and we were just delighted that the regulator, seen as quite a traditional organisation, recognised that you could be well-led and self-managed. And I think that speaks to one of the myths that there's no leadership or leader in self-managing teams. So in the next 40 minutes, I want to share some examples about how the national team works. I'm part of the national team. In traditional money, I'd be called the CEO. So I work with a small team of 6 of us who operate at that level. And I'm going to share examples from the direct delivery teams, the people who are right now supporting older people in their own homes. And as a consultant, I work with an organisation called OPAL, which is the Older Persons Advocacy Association, working specifically with older people experiencing cancer. So I've got some examples to share there. But if we start with structure, so I've worked in the NHS and I really, really know what structure looks like. But structure within wellbeing teams, there's even more of it than there was in the NHS, but it's a completely different kind of structure. So let me explain to you how that works in terms of clarity of roles and a different way to think about performance. So we have, as Lisa described, really, really clear roles, not just clear roles, but actually look and feel very different to a job description. So whenever I'm working with people, I say to people, when was the last time that you looked at your job description? And for many people, it's years, if not decades. And in self-managed teams, in wellbeing teams, we are constantly going back to our role descriptions and checking how well we're delivering what's in our roles. And one of the ways that we do that is through confirmation practices. So I'm going to share a couple of my roles with you and how I reflect on how well I'm doing through confirmation practices. And each of the roles are a way for us to live our values in practice. So Lisa, if we could look at my roles. So I have three main roles. One of my roles is around finance. So we don't have a COO in wellbeing teams. It's part of my role. I'm also responsible for outward facing communications. So we don't have a comms and marketing team, it's part of my role. And I'm also responsible for partnerships and possibilities, which organisations we partner with and what possibilities we want to explore. Now, for each of my roles, there's a certain domain which I have responsibility for. So as lead for finance, naturally, I have responsibility for the bank account. In relation to outward facing communications, again, as you can see, I have responsibility for some of our social media domains and the website too, and they're part of things that I'm responsible for making sure look good and are doing what they should do. And then on the right-hand side, you can see the accountabilities. So Tang, if you were suddenly transported to be part of my team, this is what you could expect me to be delivering on. And therefore, if you had any issues or problems with any of these, you know exactly who to go to. Elisa, if we could have the next slide. So in traditional organisations, particularly in health and care in the UK, you'll probably have an annual appraisal where your manager or your boss will give you feedback on your performance and you'll set your next year objectives. And CQC, the regulator, expect people to have 6 weekly to 2 monthly meetings with their bosses. In wellbeing teams, we reflect on our roles every 2 weeks. It's part of what we do in our team meetings, and we have weekly team meetings. We'll do it both as individual self-reflection and another buddy, somebody else, one of my peers within the team, will review with me how I'm scoring myself. So if we look at my role for outward facing communications, this is actually my confirmation practice from the 22nd of May. It explains there why that's an important role for me to have, what it means I'm doing on a weekly or a monthly basis, where you can see how well I'm doing. So if you wanted to check up on how well I'm doing, you could go onto my LinkedIn profile and see when was the last time I posted a film, and I'm expecting to post a film weekly. When was the last time I did a blog, and what I've been doing on Twitter recently. Now, the last time I did this, well, not 22nd of May, wasn't the last time I did it, but when I did this on 22nd of May, I gave myself a 4. So we score ourselves at each element of our role on 1 to 5. 1 is, I don't think I'm doing very well. 5 is, I'm doing as well as I possibly can. I gave myself a 4. Those are the reasons why I gave myself that score. And then my partner was Emily. So she spent 15 minutes looking at this with me. She said, why did you give yourself a 4 and not a 3? And I explained why. And then she said, why did you give yourself a 4 and not a 5? And I explained that I hadn't been on Twitter every day that week. And that's really what I expected from myself, to score myself a 5. And then what I do is look at my lower scores and identify something that I want to focus on over the next 2 weeks. Lisa also talked about transparent information. So we operate on Slack, which is number 2 business app in the world, I think still. It's like WhatsApp for businesses. We have a channel on Slack where we each post what we're going to be focusing on over the next 2 weeks based on our confirmation practices. And our confirmation practices on Google, so you could go and look at how I scored myself on the last 2 weeks, and anybody can. And it means I can see what every team member is working on and prioritizing to improve their competence in their roles over the next 2 weeks. Back to you, Lisa.
Thank you, Helen. So on to myth 2 then. So decision making takes a long time. So again, not many of you scored that you agreed with this, but often people assume that decision making takes a long time in a self-managing organization because there's an assumption that all decisions are made by consensus, that everyone decides everything. The reality is that there are many different ways to make decisions, and that in a self-managing organization, we become much clearer about which decision-making processes we use for which kinds of decisions. So in this table here, you can see there are 5 different decision types there. Role-based, which is where, if as part of my agreed role, I have certain decision-making authorities, then I can make a decision in the scope of that role, and I don't need to involve anyone else. I have the autonomy to make that decision because that's been agreed in my role. So it's not only managers that can do that, but anyone within the scope of a defined role. And then majority vote, you'd be familiar with, I imagine, in your organizations. And then these two here, advice process and consent-based decision-making, these are kind of two perhaps unfamiliar or newer types of decision-making that we might not be familiar with in traditional organizations. The advice process is where I, as the decision maker, would seek advice from people who had relevant knowledge and experience and people who are impacted by that decision. So if the decision I was going to make was going to impact a large number of people, then I would be expected to seek more advice from more people, so it wouldn't really be effective decision making for me to only seek advice from 2 people if the decision I'm going to be making affects a large number. So that means that you can get really meaningful participation and still empower that individual to make the decision ultimately based on integrating that advice or not if they choose not to. And then consent-based decision-making is a shift from it's not consensus and it's more, can I consent to this decision? So I might have concerns or I might have feedback, but if we can agree that this decision will not harm us as an organization or move us backwards, then we can consent to that decision and it can go ahead. So again, you can get involvement from the group, but it doesn't have to be consensus where everyone agrees wholeheartedly together. So those are just 5 examples of different decision-making processes, and the more practiced you get at these decision-making processes, the quicker they become. But even those that take a little bit longer than, say, a traditional autocratic decision, because you're generally getting more input from people, of course, you get higher quality decisions because you've involved people who have something to say about that, who are going to be impacted on it. And therefore you get that buy-in, you get that shared ownership of a decision. Over to you, Helen.
Thank you. So when I was CEO of the consultancy team, I felt like a mum. I was the mum in the team. That also kind of gave me permission to interfere in any decision that I wanted to. And most decisions would be run past me anyway. But in Wellbeing Teams, this is completely different. So our decision making is largely role-based. So as I'm lead for the finance, it means that I can make decisions about our pricing structures without consulting anybody else, as Lisa said, because that's within the domain of my decision. But we also have weekly tactical meetings and regular governance meetings. And tactical meetings are where we raise and address tensions and make decisions together, both at the national team and at the local teams. And governance meetings are used when we want to change a role, a policy, or a procedure. So Lisa, if I could introduce you to Michelle, who's the wellbeing leader in our teams in Wigan. And next to Michelle is Jodie and Becky. And one of Jodie's roles was around social media. So again, part of the benefits, I think, of self-managing teams when we're directly supporting individuals is getting decision-making as close to individuals as possible. And Becky, one of Becky's role was in recruitment, and we used value-based recruitment, and Becky was a key person within that. So if I give you a couple of examples, so at a national team, in our most recent team meeting, Kath, who has the role for social media within the national team, it's her decision making to decide which Facebook groups we keep or we start. But she used the advice process in the team because she was wondering about closing down a Facebook group, but she wanted our input and advice before she made that decision. So that was how the advice process works with us. The domain remains with Kath, it's still her decision, but she asked us all what we thought about her idea about closing the Facebook group, and then she made the final decision. Recently, we've had a change with one of our teams in Oxfordshire, moving to a different kind of regulation within CQC, our regulator, and that suggested that we needed to do something to change Ben's role. And Ben's part of the national team, and his role overall is learning and development. So we then had a governance meeting specifically to look at whether there should be a change in Ben's role, given the recent change in CQC's work. And if we can look at the next slide, Lisa. So Jodie and Becky, who you've just met, are also what we'd call key workers for 4 or 5 individuals that we support. And again, we support older people in the community, some of whom are experiencing cancer. This poster is up at the beginning of a team meeting. Everybody has a sticky with the name of the people that they're key workers for. And when they come into the room, they put their sticky on this chart here. And as you can see, we always have our purpose in front of us and our values. And if you think that the person that you're key worker for is off track in relation to their health and well-being, you put their name there. If you thought they were a bit off track, you put their name in the middle. And if you thought they were on track, you put their name there. So within 5 minutes of starting a meeting, we've got a snapshot of how the 15 or 20 people that the team support are doing. And then the team would make decisions together about whether there's anything we can do to support people who are off track to come back into bit off track or to be on track. So that would be an example of how team members would come up with decisions, and we'd make that decision either by consensus, or the key worker would make that decision because they would then be communicating it to the individual, and they have overall responsibility for how we support that person. So that's how decision making works at a team level. We have a handbook that everybody gets when they join, and that really clearly says, given your role as a wellbeing worker, these are the decisions that we expect you to make. As a team, these are the decisions that are within your domain, and these are the decisions that the national team makes. Back to you, Lisa.
Thank you. So at that point, we are going to pause. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, because we've shared quite a lot of input now with you all, and we wanted to give you a chance to digest a little bit what you've heard and to share with each other, what are you making of all of this? So I'm going to put you into some breakout groups again, and just for 5 or 6 minutes or so again, so not very long, but we'd like you to discuss in your groups, what have you heard from what Helen and I have shared? What stood out for you? What does it mean for me, for you? And what questions do you have? So I'm just going to give you a few seconds to think about that while I create some breakout rooms. Okay, so I'm going to open the breakout rooms now, and again, as I said, we'll have a little bit of time at the end to collect your questions. So any questions you do generate in your small groups now, hold on to them, and there'll be an opportunity to share them in Menti at the end of the call as well. So we'll see you back here in about 5 or 6 minutes. So people do what they want and there's no accountability. So often I think there's an assumption that if there's no managers, if there's no, top-down pyramidal hierarchy, then isn't it just laissez-faire and anyone can do whatever they want? And again, in reality, moving towards a self-managing organization is really this paradigm shift from parent-child to adult. So as Helen said, she was used to feeling like mum in her CEO role, her former CEO role. And this is kind of the paradigm of leadership that we're conditioned into through school. And then as we enter the workplace, that I, as a manager, I'm responsible for motivating people, for making sure that results are delivered. And that kind of influences my way of being and my mindset and everything. And so we can either be a sort of a caring parent or a critical parent. So either I'm someone that, I'm all about accountability and I want results and I'll correct things and I'll, use the carrot and the stick to motivate you. So if there's only accountability and low, what we call psychological safety, which means, is it safe for me to make mistakes? Is it safe for me to challenge things or ask questions or be myself? Am I going to be punished? And yet at the same time, if there's high psychological safety and low accountability, then that's also not good. And we end up in this comfort zone. And I think a lot of organizations, when they first explore being more self-managed or more distributed, they end up in this trap, a kind of comfort zone where we're all very kind to one another, we're very compassionate, but we don't know how to hold each other accountable. We don't know how to give each other feedback. We don't know how to say, hey, you haven't delivered on the things you promised you delivered a few times now. We don't know how to do that without being like the top-down command and control sort of management style or organization style that we're trying to move away from. So we can end up in this caring parent comfort zone. And so the key with self-management is actually to have a balance, to have both, to have psychological safety and accountability. So as we saw in that slide with the table from and to, those 5 processes, self-managing organizations are all about creating processes and having agreements together and having it kind of up on the table, so to speak. How do we hold one another to account? And how do we make it safe for one another to be and work together in a good way that's conducive to development and learning? And that's really, even independent of self-managing organizations, I think this development zone is what all organizations are striving for. And so this is really a key piece of self-management. So it's not anyone can do whatever they want. It is in some ways a much more adult to adult level of accountability, where it's not just because my boss will tell me off or I won't get my bonus. But it's actually that I'm co-responsible with my peers, and we have very clear agreements about what is okay and what is not okay, as Helen said, and we can talk about that together. So Helen, back to you.
I was saying in the breakout group that when I was working as an occupational therapist and I had a boss, my whole orientation was around not how do I deliver my role, but how do I impress my boss. And now that I'm working as part of a self-managed team, I actually have my confirmation practices on my desk each day, because I'm much more focused on how do I deliver my role and my accountabilities, rather than how do I impress my boss, because I don't have one. So it's really interesting for me. And I consider myself to be somebody who's responsible, somebody with great integrity, but the nature of having a boss perverts my behavior. So I'm more interested in whether they're impressed with me or not. So earlier I described how really clear roles and confirmation practices address individual accountability. But as Elisa says, it's broader than that. What's our accountability to each other? And in my consultancy role, and when I was CEO of the team there, we were much more interested in being nice to each other than we were holding each other to account, because actually we were quite scared of holding each other to account, because we wanted relationships to be comfortable and friendly, and that felt more important to us than actually delivering on what needed to be delivered. But the middle ground here, the way through this, is to have a set of team agreements which makes it absolutely clear what's okay and what's not okay, because it's easier to hold each other to account when that's crystal clear, recorded, we've all been involved in developing it, and we've all got copies of it and review it. So Lisa, if we can look at the research behind this. I know this is really tiny. This comes from Brené Brown's book, Dare to Lead, which I strongly recommend if you've not read it. And her research here with the braving definitions are how can you create trust in organisations? And you'll see there that the first one is boundaries, making it clear what's okay and what's not okay. And that's how we've been using team agreements. If we have the next slide, please, Lisa. So we build team agreements in two ways. We look at the research from Brené Brown and we look at those with the teams and say, if this is what creating trust means, how do we want to bring that into our team agreements? And then the other way we do it is from the individual. So from research, from the individual. So this is Becky again. Becky was one of our first ever wellbeing workers in the Wigan teams, and Wigan's in the north west of England. This is her on her first morning within the team in induction. And we created a work timeline for everybody and we personalised it to them. And we invited people to describe their work timeline from when they left school right up to now. In the top right-hand corner, it's if I could do anything at all. And at that stage, Becky had just come from university. She'd done a degree in theology. And at that stage in her life, she wanted to work in pastoral care in the church. That was her ultimate ambition. And at the bottom, it says, what are my skills? On the bottom right in the green, it says my interests. And then the columns in pink is what's worked in past roles and not what's not worked in past roles. So one of my what's not worked in past roles has been micromanagement. And what has worked in past roles is the ability to work across policy and at big picture things. So that's Becky's timeline. So then we asked Becky, after she'd shared it with the team, to think about what has worked in the past for her and what would we need to agree as a team to make it more likely that the things that has worked in the past for her could continue to work in this team, and to reflect on what's not worked in her previous role and what would we need to agree together as a team that would make that less likely to happen. So in the next slide, we see the actual team agreements. These were draft 1 that Becky and her team put together. And as you can see, we have our purpose at the top and our values, because team agreements have got to align with our values and help us deliver our purpose. But every team, every wellbeing team and the national team have got different team agreements because they're both rooted in research, but also in the personal experience of each team member. So on the next slide, you can see our team agreements. This is the national team. And we developed our team agreements. Now, we're a virtual team. All our meetings have only ever been via Zoom. And we work in individual offices. So having them on posters in our offices hasn't really worked for us. So we have a small version that fits inside our bullet journals. So again, it means that I can be looking at it on a weekly basis. But the danger with team agreements is they can be a bit like ground rules. If you used to go to courses when we could meet face to face and the facilitator would put ground rules together with you. And if nobody's paying attention to them, and if you don't share responsibility for delivering them, and if you don't review them, chances are they won't make much difference to the way we are together. So with team agreements, we've got 2 ways to check how well we're doing and to do something different if we're not. So in the next slide, you'll see that we use a similar process to confirmation practices. Again, actually, this is confirmation practices again, but focused on our team agreements. We do this every 6 months. So I do my own individual reflection and give myself a score on 1 to 5 against how well I think I'm living our team agreements. Again, I'll have a buddy from the team who will look at these with me and challenge me and talk to me about why I've given myself the score that I've given myself. And then for the 2 lowest ones, I'm making some personal commitments. So my very lowest one at our most recent review of our team is asking for feedback to help us grow and develop. And I have been shy to ask my colleagues, or have just not managed to find opportunities to do that. So this is the one that I wanted to do more on. So those are the things that I wanted to pay attention to. And if we look at the next slide, we did two things. So we each posted, so each team member, me, Michelle, Ben, Emily, Kath, and Mary, posted in Slack the personal commitments that we wanted to make in relation to our team agreements. And then we looked at all our scores and recognised that we had all scored ourselves lowest in asking for feedback. So we did some thinking together to say what would help us as a team get better at that team agreement. And we decided that in our weekly tactical meetings, what we'd do is we'd ask as a metric, did I ask for feedback last week? And we just each say a yes or no. And that has completely changed our behaviour. We don't have to give our examples, but I know on a Friday at 1 o'clock, my colleagues will say to me, have you asked for feedback this week? And I'll say yes or no. And I am so much more likely to say yes because of wanting to do better at our team agreements and do better at the one that I was least good at. And it's made a huge difference to me being bold enough to ask for feedback on the things that I want feedback on, as opposed to in traditional management. I was at the mercy of my manager giving me feedback on anything they wanted to give me feedback on. But the reality was I didn't get feedback until my annual appraisal, and that wasn't enough to change my behaviour. Thank you. Oh, and finally, thank you. So another way that we check on our accountabilities and check on team agreements, this is the team in Wigan. We have a person-centred team review. This was when we could meet face-to-face. We post questions around the room, and the questions are what's working and what's not working, and what do we want to focus on in the future. And it's what's working and not working around how we're delivering our team agreements, how we're living our values and purpose, and how we're working together as a team. And this is how the team then set their objectives for the next 6 months. So the whole team set their team objectives for 6 months based on their review of what they thought was working and not working about their performance, their team agreements, and how they wanted to improve. And I just think that's so radically different to the small percentage, 12 or 14%, that Lisa shared early on about where somebody being consulted on the objectives that you're expected to deliver over a year. Thank you. Back to you, Lisa.
Thanks, Helen. So we're on to our final myth now. And this is the one that when you scored this one, more people agreed with this one, or at least it was slightly more towards the right here. So I think this is quite a common myth that, well, in a self-managing organization, there are no managers, so therefore everyone must have to be equal, right? And again, it comes back to this theme that Helen and I have been touching on from parent-child to adult. And I really like this quote from Peter Block, who's written a lot about in this book Stewardship, but many books about autonomy and freedom and how we can be co-responsible together. And he says that we already know how to be good parents at work, and the alternative, what he calls partnership, is something that we're only just learning about. And the difficulty is that parenting is so deeply ingrained in our muscle memory that we don't even realize we're doing it. So like Helen said before, so often it's really well intentioned, and it's only when we start to kind of put the magnifying glass on how we're being and relating to each other that we realize, oh wow, all that stuff I've been doing is my version of being a bit like a parent, or all of that is my version of being a bit like a child and waiting for decisions to be made or for things to be improved for me. So really the kind of headline here, I suppose, is also about power, and all of the things that we've talked about up to this point. It's a different way of looking at power in organizations, and you could call it from Mary Parker Follett's work, which was amazingly, she was writing about this in the 20s, that it's about moving from power over to power with. So moving from, me as a manager having power over, your objectives or what you get to work on or your development, to more us being powerful with each other, power together. And so Helen has shared some examples of how we can do that already, I think, and she's going to share another example, which I think is really what Wellbeing Teams does really well. I think is this piece about wholeness and how we bring our whole selves to work, because if we really want to be sharing power together and holding each other to account, then we need to create a safe environment where I can show up with all of the parts of who I am, and not just my professional persona, but also, you know, what I'm feeling and what I bring from all of the other parts of my life. And so Helen's going to share some more about that now.
Thank you. Again, I appreciate that you won't be able to read the detail in the slide, but I'll give you some examples. So in our teams, both the direct delivery teams, the national team, and also with everybody that we support, so people experiencing cancer and older people, we develop a one-page profile with people. And on the left, you can see that we've done this with Opal, which is the organisation supporting and advocating with older people with cancer, and they were using it both to recruit and support volunteers. Now, in any one-page profile, there's 3 headings. And the first heading is really a strength-based approach. What do people like and admire about you or appreciate about you? What qualities do you bring that people value? And then what matters to me, and if you could read the detail, it would talk to you about my family, it would tell you about my hobbies, it would tell you the places that matter to me. And there's a beach in Wales that really matters to me that I'm not able to go to at the moment, and that's difficult. It also possessions, you know, that actually having a MacBook and an iPhone are the kind of things that matter to me. But the rhythm and pace of life and the kind of people that I like to work with. And then finally, how best to support me. So if you were suddenly transported in my team, this is what you'd need to know to support me to do my best work. So I'm the kind of person that believes that if I'm 15 minutes early for a meeting, that's a bit too close to being late. So I have a massive on-time compulsion. That means that I'm always early for things. And if I think I'm on time, that's too close to being late. But it also means that I'm very particular about people turning up on time for meetings with me as well. That it's really important to me that I'm not repeating conversations, so that if we're in a meeting together, that we've agreed who's going to be recording what we're doing. And I think it's particularly if CEOs are doing this. So there's some organisations in the UK that have their one-page profiles at the bottom of their email signature, so that you can instantly know more about the person that you're emailing. But for CEOs and for doctors and consultants to have one-page profiles. And there's a ward in Doncaster where a colleague of mine who's the consultant has got a tree on the ward, and the tree has got the mini one-page profiles of each member of staff there. And to know, for example, that a consultant has got a tortoise and loves Big Bang Theory, sort of breaks down some of those barriers and some of those assumptions that we make about people in hierarchical power. So we start with one-page profiles. We start with these in recruitment. We ask for one-page profiles, not CVs, to start off with, and we give people a template and some information about how to develop them. And I worked with a group of colleagues from 17 trusts in the UK who all support people with cancer. So people from Macmillan and who work in other hospitals. And we talked about what they thought the benefits of having one-page profiles with their hospital and community colleagues would be. And they came up with these 10 reasons. So the first one, as Lisa's just mentioned, is that everybody's seen as a person, an individual, and that helps people feel valued, builds mutual respect. It also means in the to be successful and supporting, we can put what support we need about our race or gender or culture or identity, so that we can show up and know how we can support each other in ways that fit what matters to us and who we are. That they thought it improves partnership with patients. So we also have been looking at one-page profiles with patients as the beginning of their their documentation and their files on boards. We can support people better when we know exactly how to support people. The golden rule that I'm sure you'll be familiar with says treat people in the way that you'd want to be treated. In a person-centered organisation, that's wrong. Because if you treat me the same way that you treat my extrovert colleague, Michelle, you'd be getting that completely wrong. So if you want to get hold of Michelle, she's an off-the-scale extrovert. What she'd love you to do is to phone her. If you've got anything you want to explore with her, phone her. I'm an off-the-scale introvert. Phoning me is the last thing I'd want you to do. I'd want you to get in touch by text or email, and only if we can't work it out by text and email would I want us to arrange a time to phone. And it'd be arranging a time, it certainly wouldn't be phoning me on spec. So I don't think that, aside from treating everybody with respect and generosity, etc., I think we need to know what the specific support requirements that we have of each other are to really, really support each other in a person-centered way. So therefore, not only can we better support each other, it can prevent problems and barriers in communication if we know better how to support each other. It means, and this is where it connects to leadership, we can use our talents and skills better if we can articulate them clearly to each other. It helps us understand and be more tolerant of each other. So you're more tolerant of me not wanting to speak on the phone, if you know that about me. It means that communication across hierarchy and across silos can be better if we know this about each other. We can build teams with a sense of belonging. We can learn from each other. So one of the things that I've been learning from Lisa is her skills in podcasting. And because I know that about Lisa, I feel a bit more confident asking her for feedback on my podcast. And we can match colleagues to either patients, to mentors, or to projects, and get the best match and fit, and to roles. And again, that's where people step up in leadership roles related to what they're great at. Thanks, Lisa. If we could have the next slide. And again, you won't be able to read the detail here, but I just wanted to show that, again, we've been doing this role with volunteers, looking at one-page profiles in how you can recruit volunteers, how you can support volunteers, and how you can really use the skills, talents, and leaderships of different volunteers to match them to patients or to roles within the organisation. And then finally, showing up as whole people is about what matters to us, what good support looks like, but it also has to be about how we're feeling. And when we used to meet together face-to-face in Wellbeing Teams, we'd have a board like that in the door as you come in, and you'd have a sticker with your name on it, and you'd put your name against how you're feeling. If you're feeling great, okay, not so good, struggling, etc. And then we'd start our meetings with a check-in to talk a bit more about how people are feeling and how we can support each other. And particularly in such challenging times, it's even more important that we're able to share and talk about our feelings. And in Wellbeing Teams, because we do most of our communication on Slack and therefore asynchronously and virtually, at the beginning of each day, we've got a channel called the Wellbeing channel, and we post how we're feeling. So this morning I saw most of my colleagues post a blue heart that says that they're okay. If anybody posts a green heart, gold, black, or red, you see colleagues checking in with them and saying, is there anything I can do? Do you want to chat? Hope the day is better for you. So I think if nothing else, if COVID helps us talk about our feelings, our fears, our anxieties, check in with each other and see how we're doing in a different way, that's about building connections, building support for each other, and checking in and bringing our whole selves to work in a completely new way. Back to you, Lisa.
Thanks, Helen. So that's everything from us in terms of the 4 myths of self-managing organizations and some examples from Wellbeing Teams. So as I said, we wanted to open up the possibility for you to post some questions. Again, we're going to use Menti, so I'm going to post in the chat here now the link to another Menti, which will look like this. If I share my screen again. So how it works is if you follow that link in the chat, it'll give you the option to type a question in, or if you click on the link, you can start to see as people add questions, they'll start to appear in the little pop-up box. So if you don't have a question, but you start to see other questions appear and you think, oh yeah, that's a good question, I like that, then you have the option to click a little thumb button and then that votes on the question there. So I'll give you a couple of, here we go. So there's our first question. So yes, we absolutely will share these slides, and we also are going to share a kind of takeaway document with some more resources and links and things like that, so that you can go and learn some more. So let's see, we have a few more coming in. So I guess I can cycle through these, can I? Here we go. So we might even have time, Helen, to answer one or two of these. So perhaps we could say something about this one, how you can move towards becoming self-managing teams. What would you say, Helen, in response to that one?
I'm working with some organisations at the moment who aren't sure if they want to become fully fledged self-managing teams, but want to move towards greater autonomy in the way that they're working. And one of the very first things that we do is the team agreement. So unless you're clear and you've got recorded, Brené's phrase is clear is kind, unless you're really clear about how to support each other to show up at work, to do their best work in the way that they work together, it's really hard to build in greater accountability. So that would be one thing that I'd suggest. I think the clarity about how decisions get made. So it's very rare in organisations that there's a document that says, here's how we make decisions. The assumption is that the manager makes all the decisions, or in a meeting they're made by consensus. So getting clearer about that, I think, is really helpful. And then moving towards transparency around roles. What can you expect from me? So you can't really have greater autonomy and accountability unless we know what we expect from each other, both in relation to individual roles and in terms of how we work together as a team. So those are some things that you could introduce to your organisations without making a commitment to move towards full self-managed teams, but you'll definitely increase the adult-to-adult behaviour and increase the autonomy and accountability if you move in those directions. What about you, Lisa?
Yeah, I think that's some really valuable starting points. And I guess it's also worth saying, and it might be stating the obvious here, but there's no one way of doing this. So Helen and I both have podcasts, actually, and many of the people we speak to on the podcast, all of them have done it in a completely different way. And I guess my invitation would be to start a conversation and to kind of enroll your colleagues in the possibility of this. So I think it's less about, okay, I need to go and come up with a plan and kind of launch it, and more about, I have a feeling that if we could work in a more involving way, if we could have more clarity about what our roles are and the decision-making processes, that would really help us to be much more engaged and supporting each other. I would like to explore how we could do this. What do you think?
I have great caution around using the word self-management as well. So what I've learned is that creates a knee-jerk reaction, typically around middle managers who think if we work towards self-management, it means I'm out of a job, and why would turkeys welcome Christmas in that kind of way? So the conversations that I tend to have with people is, what would a bit more autonomy look like? A bit more accountability look like? Are there steps we can move in that direction? And as Lisa said, there are other ways organisations approach this, is by setting up some prototype teams who are really excited about moving this direction, to do some test and learn work and to see what that looks like.
Yes. So let's see. I don't know how these are sorted, if they're sorted by number of votes. Gosh, that's an interesting, I've never been asked that question before. Gender differences. Yeah, it's interesting, I guess, but I suppose this is maybe reflective of the sector, but a lot of the guests that you and I have on our podcast, Helen, tend to be women, don't they? So there is a sort of, I wonder if, yeah, what are your thoughts?
Out of the 7 organisations that I'm directly working with around self-management, 6 out of 7 have got CEOs who are women. I don't know, this is about power, and I guess it depends what your perception are around the gender differences in using and embracing power, and I think they are what are showing up in this kind of work. Has been my personal experience. I feel really nervous making proclamations around gender imbalances generally, but my experience has been that some of this has been, most of the work that I've seen about organisations moving this direction has been led by women so far.
Mm. I feel like with 1 minute left, we'll probably not be able to do justice to some of these questions. But as I said, our promise is that we're going to gather these, and thank you for volunteering these questions and for voting on them, because that will help us to sort of sort them and prioritize them in terms of, you know, what are the most pressing questions for you. And we promise that we'll write a follow-up blog answering those questions. And of course, we're not experts in this, but we'll share what we've learned and what we've found is useful. So thank you for those, and we'll keep you posted. So Alessandro, I don't know if you want to close the session and wrap us up here.
Thank you, Lisa. Well, really just to say thank you to you and Helen to share. Quite insightful. I really enjoyed it, and I think I personally learned a lot. And I hope that all our members here were able to grasp a few ideas of why this concept could be relevant for us as an organization, and how it relates to your role. And even if not fully embracing the idea of self-management, I think I certainly picked up a lot of very useful tips that one can start applying right away, particularly if we all talk about person-centered care and being the issue of solidarity with your colleagues and the people you serve. So thanks for a very inspiring sessions, and I hope that everybody enjoyed it. Thanks for staying till the end. I know an hour and a half can be quite long, but it flew by for me. And as I said at the beginning, please do check on our website for coming up dialogues. We have another one next Thursday on digital leadership. You'll receive the information, and obviously there will be a follow-up blog on this one, and we'll make sure that there's learning and the recording available for others. Thanks, Lisa. Thanks, Ellen. And thanks, everybody, for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.